Hello, and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. The History with Jackson podcast is presented by Past and Present Media, the home of accessible history. Now today in the podcast episode, guys, we speak to Andrew Long, who is a historian and author of several amazing books. And in this episode today, we touch on, spies, espionage, the Cold War context around Germany and Berlin. It's a really interesting conversation. I learned so much from it, and I know you guys are really going to enjoy it. So, without further ado, we're going to jump into messages from our supporters that really help History of Jackson do what it does, and then we'll be jumping into the podcast episode with Andrew. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you very much for listening, guys, and sit back and enjoy. Now, the Bean Around Coffee sponsor this episode of History of Jackson, and if you know me, you know I love coffee, and the Bean Around is my daily drink of coffee, and I grab it online or in the store. If you want to grab yourself some of this amazing coffee, head to thebeanaround.com and use the discount code HWJ, the little symbol, and the bear 10 for 10% off any coffee purchases. That is thebeanaround.com and HWJ and the bear 10 for 10% off. Now, here at History of Jackson, I really enjoy bringing different history content to you every month. And one place that I get my history content from is Accessible Art History, the podcast. This is a podcast for you if you are fascinated by the history of art and culture and you want to learn more about works of art, famous artists, or exciting archaeological discoveries. Accessible Art History aims to provide to you free quality art history content for anyone who is curious. It is committed to history, knowledge, content, and having fun whilst learning. I really enjoy learning my art history from Accessible Art History, the podcast. So if you want to learn more about art history, head to Accessible Art History, the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any major podcast player. That is Accessible Art History, the podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast. I hope you're all doing okay. Today we are speaking to historian and author Andrew Long, all about his book, Secrets of the Cold War, Espionage and Intelligence Operations, from both sides of the Iron Curtain. How are you doing, Andrew?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thanks for having us on.
No, it's absolutely brilliant to speak to you, and I really, really enjoyed this book. So I'm looking forward to really getting stuck into the different topics that you touch in it, and helping everyone learn more about this secret dark arts of the Cold War.
It's a fascinating area. I mean, when you start to scratch the surface and see what was going on for such an extended period of time, most wars, thankfully, are very short and sharp. The Cold War lasted for four decades, and the stuff that was going on in the background throughout that time was really intense and not really understood by the general public, because most of it was in the shadows. It was the secret world. So I had a lot of fun trying to unearth some of these stories, and also what I found really interesting was how a lot of them were interconnected. And that sort of got me questioning, trying to understand how it all fits together. So yeah.
And you can definitely tell whilst reading it that you really enjoyed writing and researching for the book. But I just wanted to ask you firstly, what was your inspiration for writing this book?
Well, I sort of began writing for about 2015, 2016, that time. Started off as like an amateur armchair historian, and then I started making some notes, and then I thought, okay, hang on a sec, this could fit together in a book, and pitched it to a couple of publishers, and they said yes, amazingly. So, but I focus on the Cold War. That's my area of interest. I'm not an academic. I'm a lapsed marketing guy, but I'm learning new stuff every day. It's fascinating. But the Cold War was mostly fought in the shadows. Yes, there were some very sharp, overt conflicts. Vietnam, Korea, for example, they were Cold War conflicts. But over the period of time that the Cold War lasted, let's say 1945 through to, say, 1994. That's my interpretation of the Cold War. Other people will have different interpretations, but 45 to 94, over that time, it was fought in the shadows. And what I was finding is that, or what I was seeing in my research, was that both sides were putting a lot of time and effort, energy, money into trying to obtain intelligence on the opposition, and the whole idea was to give them an advantage in a future conflict. And of course, that future conflict would have probably been World War III. And that meant that the intelligence collection agencies, who we'll talk about in a minute, the spies and the technologies, developed like really fast. And it became a real core element of the Cold War, and you can't understand the Cold War. We were saying before we went on air, but we can't really understand the Cold War without understanding Stalin. Well, I tried to look at communism as well, because I thought that was a very important thing, but also trying to understand espionage, because it was at the very heart of the Cold War.
And I really agree with that point there, is you have to understand not only Stalin, but communism in this as well, because there was two distinct systems, one of which we understand because we live in, but another one that is quite difficult to get your head around and grasp because we have no experience of living under communism or communist regimes. Now, you mentioned there about espionage units and services. You talk a lot, obviously, because the book about espionage, about these different secret services that operate during the Cold War. Would you mind detailing, what these are and what some of their roles are?
It's a sort of baffling number of agencies, to be honest, because it was a mixture of what they call HUMINT, HUMINT, which is human intelligence, which is probably what you and I would understand as spies, guys creeping around, pinching bits of information, human intelligence. But there was also signals intelligence, which is basically intercepting phone calls, radio messages, that sort of thing. And then later on, as technology moves forward, there's electronic intelligence, ELINT. So you've got HUMINT, SIGINT, and ELINT. And there's a few others as well, but these are the most of them. And the electronic intelligence is basically picking up the enemy's radar transmissions and things like anti-aircraft radar. If you pinpoint where the radar's coming from, then you can target it to destroy the anti-aircraft. That's how that works. And that was happening all the time over the years as the technologies developed. The three main perpetrators I talk about in the book are the Soviets, the Americans, and the British. But it's fair to say every NATO and Warsaw Pact country had their own intelligence infrastructure. And to a greater or lesser extent, they talk to each other. Not necessarily all the time, but enough to, obviously keep this intelligence machine going. So in the UK, we had SIS, Secret Intelligence Service. Now, that's what they're called. Everybody calls them MI6. But actually, they don't call themselves MI6. They call themselves SIS. They were only sort of in the public domain, if you like, relatively recently, in the 90s. But their job is foreign intelligence. So that's the James Bond, if you like, world. So that's them getting intelligence on other countries, sometimes our friends, sometimes our enemies. Then you have MI5 on the domestic intelligence, and where it sort of overlaps for me is the counterintelligence work. So basically catching enemy spies. So that's MI5. And then we have GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, which is down in Cheltenham. And their job is to intercept SIGINT. Generally, ELINT tends to be a military task. So basically, you have people tracking enemy electronic emissions, and so that's more of a military thing rather than a pure intelligence. In parallel with the spooks, there is a huge military intelligence operation run out of the Ministry of Defense. So there's a massive organization there. In the US, they had the CIA, on foreign intelligence. Most people would be familiar with that. The FBI on domestic and, again, counterintelligence, so similar parallel to MI6 and MI5. And they had the NSA, which is the National Security Agency on SIGINT. And a very similar setup. There was a parallel military structure, but a load more. I mean, the Americans have so many different agencies looking at different bits and bobs. In the Soviet Union, the most famous intelligence arm that everyone will have heard of is the KGB, but it was only called that from 1954. It went back as far as the revolution. So 1917, they had the Cheka, the CHEKA, and that was set up, and they were responsible for internal security, primarily, repressing the civilian population, keeping them under control, suppressing any opposition quite brutally in many cases, but also responsible for foreign intelligence. So, as I say, they were formed in 1917. And then over the years, as Moscow reorganized and as the power bases shifted, so did the name over the door. NKVD, many people would have heard of. OGPU, NKGB, MGB, all these different initials, pretty much the same organization with perhaps different people at the top, a slightly different emphasis, but it was the same core Chekist organization. And then, the NKVD in particular were responsible for Stalin's brutal purges. And the intelligence collection only really settled down after Stalin's death, and Khrushchev was maneuvering himself into the top spot. Stalin liked to ensure that his intelligence officers never got too comfortable. That was one of his biding objectives, and he deliberately built conflict into the system. So he established a parallel intelligence agency led by the military, which was the GRU. So what you had was the GRU and the KGB. Let's call it the KGB because it's easier than remembering all those other acronyms. And they fought over territory, they fought over agents, and they fought over secrets. And this went on right through the Cold War. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the KGB was split into two. So they have this SVR, which is the foreign intelligence, and they have the FSB on domestic. And the GRU, it's now called the GU, pretty much carried on. They carried on quietly in the background. It should be remembered that Russian President Vladimir Putin was a KGB officer. And there's a famous expression that once a Chekist, always a Chekist. You can see that many of the initiatives coming out of Moscow now that are going on perhaps on the international stage to do with Ukraine and so on, they're coming straight out of the KGB playbook. Some of the techniques date back to the Cheka, which is extraordinary, but that's really how this intelligence landscape is relevant to today.
And what I find most fascinating there is that just the sheer confusion within that Soviet system of, who's looking after what, whose agent is whose, and so on. And I just want to ask, why were these two different agencies operating at the same time in different nations like the UK and the US?
What's amazing is, with all that chaos, with that conflict going on, that they managed to achieve so much. So that's one of the striking things that I see. Basically, the KGB and the GRU operated all over the world, in the US and the UK, and they competed and they fought over assets. In theory, the KGB was the more senior of the two. They would normally win an argument for resources or over an agent, but Stalin ravaged his society at all levels, government, industry, and the KGB, and he purged thousands and thousands of officers. So the people doing the purge in turn got purged, and that took out huge levels of expertise. So when that happened, the GRU were ready in the wings to take over the agents and the networks. So that was quite an important sort of redundancy, if you like. And then also, in terms of redundancy, when a network got broken up, when the counterintelligence people did their job and arrested all the agents, it helps to have a second agency in the wings. And that worked. Exactly that happened at the end of the Second World War. We'll talk about that in a minute, how the atomic spies all got, most of them got arrested or escaped. But that when that happened, there was a massive hole in the intelligence operation, and the GRU were just able to go, okay, we'll take over. So that's how it worked.
And it's great that they could work together kind of in a way to make sure those gaps are filled so that you're not losing out in those intelligence battles.
Not sure they worked. Not sure they worked together, but yeah, they worked in. Let's say they worked in parallel.
Yeah, that's probably a better way of explaining that. You mentioned something there about the atomic spies, and I just wanted to touch. What was the main aim then of Soviet espionage of this period?
Well, as I think I might have said, it's all about gaining an advantage over the competition. That's what it was all about, and that could be prior notice of plans. What are their intentions? What are they going to do? It could be gathering compromising material on a prominent individual to use for blackmail. I mean, that went on. It still goes on. And all that was true for the Soviets back in the day and the Russians today. But before the Second World War, the Soviet Union was lagging behind the rest of the world in terms of science, technology, high tech. They were living through this disastrous central planning. The infamous 5-year plans had created this huge, lumbering, inefficient monster, producing lots of things that nobody needed at the wrong time. I mean, it was just a complete disaster. As the Soviets got further and further behind around the rest of the world, storm clouds were beginning to gather. Hitler was doing his thing. It was all beginning to sort of brew up. And Stalin realized at some point in perhaps the late 30s, certainly as the Second World War began, that this planned economy that he'd built with enormous human cost, was not going to be up to face the challenges ahead. So the only way for him to progress or even survive was to steal the technology from the more advanced Western countries, and it was a smash and grab raid. It was as simple as that. So what he did was, going back to the 1930s, started to build these networks within all aspects of Western society: industry, science, technology, politics, economics, academia, and the military. And agents all in those sectors stole secrets and passed them back. And we've got the whole issue of motivation, ideological motivation, and that sort of stuff. But it was already an intelligence collecting machine designed to level up the Soviet Union's ability. During the Second World War, the biggest secret out there, even bigger than the breaking of the Enigma code, which many people might have heard of, was the work being undertaken by the Manhattan Project, the project to build the atomic bomb, which was a enormous concern, but one that was done under the most extreme secrecy you can imagine. Stalin, however, learnt the project was underway and knew he had to have that information. So through these efforts to penetrate, in particular, politics and science and academia, he was able to learn all about the bomb as it was happening, almost live information. I think when they did the Trinity test in the desert in 1945, the precursor to the Hiroshima bomb, I think he learnt about the results of that bomb only a few days after it happened, which is extraordinary to think that sort of level of knowledge. But anyway, he was able to learn about these secrets as they happened in Canada, in the US, in the UK, as they were happening.
And it's fascinating as well that level of information is able to travel from the middle of America and Canada right across to to Moscow with such an astonishing level of speed.
Mm.
And there's yeah, and there's vast amount of information there. You've got dossiers, you've got documents. How were these agents able to feed back this information then?
With the atomic spies, you've got a really challenging thing because the information they're talking about was so complicated. It was so cutting edge that only perhaps a few people in the world could actually understand it. So you try to get that being passed down a chain. Yeah, that was really tough. The way they did it was built a structure. So it's all about structures and infrastructure. So basically, the key agencies, the KGB and the GRU, they were represented by a resident in the foreign country. In this case, the US. There was a resident, and he was like the head of station or station chief. He'd be based in the residentura, which would normally be in an embassy or consulate. In the States, there was the embassy in Washington, and there was various consulates around the country because it's so big, and basically gave them intelligence stations all over the country. Fantastic. Within these residenturas, there'd be what's known as legal officers. So they'd be working under diplomatic cover, things like trade attaché or cultural attaché, and they'd have diplomatic protection. And there would also be illegal officers. So these would be living undercover in the community without any of those protections. These legal and illegal officers would recruit agents, and they recruit them from all different parts of society, as we've said. And the officers would in effect be the agents' handlers. There's lots of vernacular that sort of crops up in the world of espionage. Sometimes it's quite interesting to try and keep track of it all. Now, the embassies, they'd have the means to communicate with Moscow by radio or by coded telegrams or diplomatic pouches. So, a diplomatic bag or a diplomatic pouch could be a massive box, it could be a shipping container, but it has diplomatic protection. So as part of international law, it cannot be intercepted. And that means that information and then material, that's important, can be shipped from one place to another, completely protected by diplomatic convention. And so with our atomic spies, yes, you had these incredibly complicated formula and information, but you also had samples of radioactive material that were smuggled out, and that they were taken and put in a box and sent via this diplomatic pouch. It's extraordinary. And so these agents would also have couriers who would be go-betweens. So, for example, you had somebody working in the desert in Los Alamos, and there'd be a courier who'd travel to perhaps Santa Fe, where they'd meet up, either meet up and have a cup of tea together, or they'd have a covert meet somewhere outside the town. Information would be passed. The scientists would go back to Los Alamos. The courier would disappear back to Washington or wherever, and that's how it went. They'd sometimes have clandestine radio, so really high-powered, high-tech radio transmitters, and they'd also use clandestine communications such as microdots. So basically, you get a sheet of paper; it gets reduced to, in effect, the size of a full stop, and then that can get glued into a book on a particular page, a particular line, and then they remove the microdots, and using like a microscope, they could read the information. So it's some very clever techniques, and that's what's known as tradecraft. Now, a lot of these names I'm talking about, like tradecraft, and that's the language of John le Carre in his spy books, and it's really interesting how words that he came up with in fiction have been adopted by the actual real spy world. So tradecraft is a classic example. But anyway, that's the techniques they use to talk between an agent and a handler. So it could be a little chalk mark on a lamppost or a drawing pin on a bus shelter that would tell the agent or the handler that something needs to happen, or I need to contact you, blah blah blah.
with all these, all these different tradecrafts going on and all these different agents attached to handlers, how do these kind of rings of spies fall apart?
Think of a spy network as a house of cards. You build up playing cards on top of each other, form this quite substantial structure. All it takes is one card to come out and the whole lot falls down. And so a spy network can look solid, it can look safe, but it's very fragile. So what happens? One agent gets caught, he is interrogated, he gives up secrets, or he's convinced convinced that he needs to, sell out his masters. He then in turn implicates somebody else, and the network all collapses. Or perhaps a row of dominoes would be another way of describing it. You knock one domino, all the others go in sequence. So spies can be caught red-handed. You're nicked by vigilant security or counterintelligence. But most, to be honest, are brought down by betrayal, where one of their own defectors are prime sources of intelligence, or the ability to break up intelligence networks. But they opt to cooperate in return for a more lenient punishment, and that's how most of them fell. The first to fall was a British scientist called Alan Nunn May, who was revealed to be a Soviet agent in some documents that were taken by a Soviet cipher clerk who defected in Canada in, I think it was 45, I think this happened. And he was identified and he was arrested and nicked. The next big break was the cracking of a diplomatic cipher. So I talked about these embassies talking back to Moscow. Well, of course, the information wasn't sent in plain text. It was carefully encoded. And they used something called a one-time pad, which is still used today. It's a, in theory, unbreakable code. You have a series of numbers at one end, you have a series of numbers at the other end, and as long as both ends are using the same set of numbers, then sorted. Nobody can actually break that. But where it goes wrong, and in this case, it was a printing error, and some of the old books that should have been shredded were sent out to agents, and that gave, when they found that, these very clever people who do code breaking, they found that, and that was a key that they could use to get into the code, and that happened. So they managed to break these diplomatic codes, so they were able to listen to diplomatic traffic going between the various Moscow embassies and consulates back to Moscow, and that gave them an insight as to what was going on. One of the big deals that started breaking up the spy ring was when a cryptographer, Meredith Gardner, the guy was called, he partially decoded a message, a 1944 message. So this was 1946, 2 years after the message was intercepted. It took him that long before he could actually get in there. And it listed a load of scientists from Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project. Now, why was this diplomat talking to somebody in Moscow about these scientists? And that started this, oh, hang on a second, perhaps the biggest secret of the war was actually penetrated. So they began to work with the FBI, and they slowly began piecing together the different pieces of the atomic spies. And the first to fall was a guy called Klaus Fuchs. Now, this project to break the code is called Venona, Venona. And that doesn't mean anything, but it was just the name given to this immense code-breaking effort. And Klaus Fuchs he was a British scientist. He was a German who had escaped Nazism. A very, 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 very bright guy. Was spotted for his excellence in physics, and he was brought onto the project. All along, he was a communist and was working for the project and the Soviet Union in parallel. And the way they did it was his code name began to appear in regular messages. And they sort of mapped all these messages out, and they worked out, oh, what's he talking about? Oh yeah, this guy does this. Oh yeah, he does it there. He does it then. And they literally pieced together in an amazing bit of detective work. And they identified that it had to be Klaus Fuchs because of all these connections. So they confronted him, and he caved. He sang like a canary, because he realised that after all these years of covert living, this double life, that perhaps this was a way out of it. But he was arrested, and convicted and sent to jail. So with our House of Cards analogy, he was the first card out of the mix, and the rest just tumbled around them. Some spies were caught, some spies defected, and I go through this in the book, before they got out just in time, and others, for various reasons, got away scot-free, got just completely missed the whole thing and lived out their lives with this massive secret behind them. But they weren't really discovered until after their deaths.
It's so fascinating that it just relies on one person not squealing, one person not doing something, and the whole thing comes tumbling down, using that analogy you just mentioned. Now, obviously, if one person gets caught, you get a whole ring that collapses. And during your book, you speak about another kind of event that has a similar effect, called it's an intelligent event called Black Friday. So what was Black Friday, and what was the solution to Black Friday?
Well, Black Friday's at the core of this Venona project. So they were intercepting diplomatic traffic, and that was going on between 1942, I think it was, and 1948. And this was going on, and they were collecting thousands and thousands of messages. It was taking them a while to decode them, but they were working through it. Then on Friday, the 29th of October, 1948, all of a sudden, it went dark overnight. The Soviets changed their codes. Somebody had told them that the West had broken their diplomatic codes. So what do? Completely change the code system. And that blacked out any further collection until they re-broke the code. That was a big problem, because they were able to, they were beginning to identify the atomic spies, as we've seen with Klaus Fuchs, but they lost this information as to what the Soviets were up to, what their intentions were. And that goes back to one of the core reasons why people want to collect intelligence. So, crikey, what do? Well, they had to try and find another solution. Basically, there were two people who betrayed the secret. One was a fairly low-level guy called William Weisband. He was a linguist employed by the Army Signals Agency, who were doing this translation, this code breaking. And he basically blew the secret to the Soviets. And there's a more famous guy called Kim Philby, who was one of the Cambridge Five. And while he was in Washington, stationed as SIS station chief in Washington, he was able to tell them, listen, guys, they're listening to your traffic. They're listening to your diplomatic traffic. You need to be aware of this. And those two bits of information made the Soviets perk up and basically, let's change the codes. So big issue for the West, and so they had to try and find another way of picking up information.
And again, it's just fascinating how two people, one more important, one very lowly, can really change the face of espionage in a night. Now, there's one spy that you talk about in your book who I think you bring his story to life, and he sounds like such a fascinating character, and that is George Blake. So, who was George Blake, and how did he develop into this fascinating character?
The story of George Blake it's almost so fantastic you couldn't make it up. It's an amazing story, and I think you probably tell from the book I got quite into the story. I quite enjoyed writing about it, because it is such a good tale. So he was born a guy as George Behar, Behar. He was a son of a Turkish Jew father and a Dutch Protestant mother. Lived in Rotterdam in Holland. when he was 18, so this is basically during the war, he was reaching the age of majority. All of a sudden, he was going to be arrested for being a potential alien, a potential issue. Under 18, he was left with his family. As soon as he turned 18, he was going to be targeted by the authorities. So he left Rotterdam. He made this epic journey across war-torn Europe. He went from Rotterdam to Paris, occupied Paris, went down through Vichy, France, which of course is a very hostile place. It's basically French governed, but governed as puppets for the Nazis. Made his way to Spain, where he got put into a Spanish concentration camp. He managed to get released from there, found his way to Gibraltar, and then caught a boat from Gibraltar back to, I think it was Liverpool he came into. An epic journey. He was 18 years old, for goodness sake. It took him 2 years to make this journey. And he arrived, took the anglicised name of Blake, so it wasn't George Bahar, it was George Blake, and he joined the Royal Navy. He wanted to serve. His father had served in the First World War for the British, so he saw himself as British, although he had this extraordinarily cosmopolitan background. He had relatives who were Egyptian. He had the Turkish element, you had the Jewish element, you had the Dutch. He was a very cosmopolitan guy. So he joined the Royal Navy. But because of his language skills, he was very quickly plucked out from being a sub-lieutenant on a ship somewhere, and he got posted to SIS, to MI6. And he basically spent the war working for the Dutch section. Then he was, as the Allies moved towards Berlin, he went to Holland and operated there for SIS again. And then he went to Germany and operated there. After most of his colleagues were demobbed, he decided he would stay on to become a full-time intelligence officer. At this stage, he's a loyal British intelligence guy. Yes, he's got a cosmopolitan outlook, more so than his colleagues. Yes, he didn't go to the right schools and that sort of stuff, but he was having this career, and they sent him off to learn Russian, which was obviously a very useful thing.
Learning Russian, he's an incredibly talented man. How does this man who considers himself British is such a loyalist, how does he become a double agent then?
Well, his first posting, so they teach him Russian, and then they decide to send him to Korea. So the typical sort of British government logic. So he basically was posted to Korea, to the Seoul embassy, under diplomatic cover. So he was a legal resident, if you like, to use the terminology from before. But his job was to try and gather intelligence on Russia and China. It was a really difficult job. I mean, he had, yes, the Russian language training, and he had some basic training, but he was basically thrown in it. And I think he had quite a hard time there, because gathering intelligence on both those nations was really difficult, especially from where he was positioned. So when North Korea, backed by the Chinese, invaded the South in June 1950, Seoul was overrun, and Blake was captured. The British didn't evacuate their people quick enough, and they were captured, and they became prisoner. And he had an awful time. I mean, the conditions were appalling. They were force marched hundreds of miles in terrible weather conditions. Many of his compatriots died. It was brutal. But over that time, he had a sort of epiphany. He became a convert to communism. He was aware of it. He was interested in it. He'd shunned religion in an early age, but he sort of latched on to communism as perhaps a new religion, if you like. And eventually, he was in a camp in North Korea. He offered his services. He said, I want to speak to the Russians. And they sent some people in there, and they had some conversations. And he basically voluntarily offered his services. I work for British intelligence. I want to work for you. And it was as simple as that. After Stalin had died, they managed to get these guys released. So he came back to the UK in 1953, again after this amazing journey from North Korea all across the Soviet Union, all across Europe. Anyway, he got back and was welcomed back into the SIS fold. He was, welcomed back as a sort of like almost a hero, because he'd endured and survived this experience. Began his career again, and while he was doing that, he was passing all his secrets straight to the Soviets.
It's such a fascinating tale. Going through all these experiences as a young man and as an agent, and then converting, and believing this new kind of religion. But it kind of highlights one thing for me, really. It highlights this British system and its disjointedness. How does the British intelligence system work at this time? Because it doesn't seem to be working quite so well in George Blake's case.
No, well, it's working very well for George Blake, simply because he was able to work under the radar. Basically, the system was run on the old school tie principle, or the old boys network. What school did you go to? Ah, yes, my people know your people, sort of thing. It was like a gentleman's club, and a man's word is his bond. That's how it was run. Although Blake was a bit of an outsider, he was always thought of as a bit foreign. He didn't go to Eton, he didn't go to Oxford. He'd had this education of an incredible exposure to the world, far more than many of these guys had. But he was just a bit odd, so he was an outlier. He wasn't one of the guys as such. But he carried on. He now had this new family that he was working for. And basically, the Soviets, they saw this creaking system and they exploited it. They exploited it fantastically, successfully. They placed agents right at the top of government and politics and the secret services. You had the Cambridge Five, who were all at the height of the establishment. You had Guy Burgess, who was a broadcaster and also worked for the MI6. You had Kim Philby, who was a SIS, a real high flyer in SIS. You had Donald MacLean, who worked in the Foreign Office. You had John Cairncross, who was one of the last to be discovered. Actually, he was a senior civil servant, but basically was the sort of the right hand man to some very important people. And the last was Anthony Blunt, who was a art historian of all things, but he was very part of the establishment. He knew the Queen very well. He knew the Queen Mother very well. And these were establishment people, all true communists and Soviet spies. So yeah, they were very well placed to make this happen. And the system that they worked within, the antiquated system of the time, was perfect for exploitation.
It's so fascinating to kind of hear that this system was, for a country that prides itself on its organization and so on, is creating a system that is so creaking and antiquated that it's so easy to exploit. And there's probably a bit of pride there and a bit of arrogance thinking that it's not going to be exploited.
Yeah, very much so. But when the Soviets changed their codes and it went dark, Black Friday, they had to get back into the Soviet communications. They had to find a way of finding out what they were up to and what their intentions were, and fundamentally, are they about to attack us? So they came up with this plan, extraordinary plan, and I talk about it at length in the book. It was one of those ones that got me interested, because it was definitely worth researching. So Berlin was a 4-power controlled city. So it was split into 4. It was run by the Soviets, the Americans, the French, and the British, and they all had different regions. And the Americans discovered that the main Soviet telephone lines traveled in and out of the city very close to the sector border between the American sector and the Soviet sector. It's a little village called Old Glinica. It's just a church and a few houses, nothing big, but it went along this road that was going down to what became the main airport in East Berlin. And a few feet under the ground was this cluster of cables through which all this mass of telephone and data, what we call data now, what they called it back then was telegraph, communication was going on a few feet underground. So they came up with this plan to basically dig a tunnel under the border. At the moment, there was no Berlin Wall. We're talking a few years before the Berlin Wall. So they basically dig a tunnel under this border that wasn't fenced in any way, find the cables and tap them. And this project was called Operation Gold. So what they did was they bought a patch of land opposite Alt-Glienicke, place called Rudow, Rudow. I'm pronouncing it badly. They built this large warehouse from where the tunnel was built. And what they did was they, in effect, dug a hole to fill with soil. So in the basement of this huge warehouse, they dug it all out, creating this massive void, this sort of false floor. And they then started digging down, and all the spoil from the tunnel was piled up inside the warehouse. And the warehouse was disguised as a SIGINT, collection station. So basically listening to radio traffic of the aircraft moving around. So it was like doing it in plain sight. So they began this tunnel. It was a huge operation, all done in total secrecy. It was one of the other big secrets, but involved thousands of people all working in compartmentalized so that the secret could be controlled. They began digging in September 1954. So basically, Blake was back, and he was back working for SIS again. And they finished the tunnel in February 55. And they made the first tap the following month. And then over the next 3 or 4 months, they managed to tap all the cables. And it was done by the digging was done by the American engineers. The actual phone tapping was done by the post office, the British Post Office, because they had these very high-tech skills that they could go into a cable, intercept it without letting anybody know. It was ultra secret. Anyway, so the phone calls and these telegraph messages all of a sudden started flowing in by the thousand. Literally every phone call was being listened to, and they had banks and banks and banks of tape recorders. They also had machines that would interpret the telegraph messages. So it was basically streams of data that they had to then try and decode. And they had this massive operation in London and in Washington, D.C., where the information would be processed, it would be transcribed, it would be translated, it would be decoded, analysed. It was huge. And this operation went on and on and on. The irony behind the whole thing is that Blake had betrayed the secret of the tunnel to the Soviets before they dug the first spade. And it basically told them, listen, guys, they're about to tap your cables. He was involved in the meeting between the Americans and the British, which decided how they were going to run the project. He literally took the minutes of the meeting. That was his job. Gave one set to the team, to the Operation Gold people. Took another copy and gave it to the Soviets. So they knew everything. The problem was, if they basically intercepted this tunnel, it would have, the only person who perhaps could have betrayed the whole thing would have been Blake. And so the Soviets were faced with this awful challenge. If we basically discover this tunnel, it could lead to our star agent being caught. Now, given the fact that Burgess and McLean had already been discovered, they'd defected a few years previously. Kim Philby had been sidelined because of his connection with Burgess and McLean, and a few years later he would actually be arrested, or attempted to be arrested, before he defected. So Blake was their star. In fact, his code name was Diamond, because he was that valuable to the Soviets. So they had to protect him. And the only way they could protect him was to let this intelligence gathering run. It's a very courageous decision, but it was worth a price worth paying if it meant that he remained undiscovered.
And it's fascinating how the Russians have been faced with that decision. And it shows the fragility of these systems that they rely upon one man. Now, obviously, Blake is, given this system up to the Russians. Do they ever act upon that information?
Well, after a year, just under a year, actually, they decided that the deception had run its course. That they'd sort of given as much as they could give, and then they arranged that for the taps to be accidentally discovered by East German telecoms engineers. There were faulty lines because of rainwater and that sort of stuff, and that was the excuse. So then basically, a bit like Black Friday, all of a sudden it just stopped the operation. And the Soviets and East Germans had this media frenzy. They had this massive propaganda thing, projecting their outrage to the world's media. The world's media, obviously, the Warsaw Pact media shouted from on high, "What a terrible liberty! What a crime!" Blah blah blah. The Western media thought, "Oh, actually, yeah, fair play." Good on the Americans and British for actually bringing about this coup. So, it was the battle lines were being drawn quite nicely between the two sides there. So basically, Blake managed to survive this operation. Nobody was able to put a connection to Blake, and he carried on with his spying. In early 1961, basically this secret guy, he started to talk to Western intelligence, and he started passing them quite solid intelligence. He was given the code name of Sniper, and he began to suggest that there was an agent within SIS, and an agent was within the Admiralty, the Royal Naval Admiralty. And what happened was they started to do some investigations. George Blake was cleared. He was, there was no suspicion about him. And then in early 1961, this guy Sniper decides, "I'm going to defect." And so all of a sudden, chaos breaks loose because this guy's basically defecting. And very soon, they begin to put Blake and the tunnel and other incidents that he betrayed together. And all of a sudden, again, very good detective work, they began to put the pieces together, and Blake increasingly became a suspect. He was basically arrested. He was sent to trial and convicted in May 1961. And he was sentenced to this extraordinary 42-year sentence, which at the time was, I think, the longest sentence anybody had ever given. So we got this guy who started off in Holland as an 18-year-old, had this amazing adventure across Europe, then became a spy, went to Korea, got captured, converted, and then all of a sudden now he finds himself in prison. The story doesn't end there, which again is part of this fantastic story. He escapes. He escapes from Wormwood Scrubs in October 1966. Extraordinary story. He then gets smuggled with some left-leaning sort of activists who basically take George Blake in, take him across the channel in a hidden compartment in a camper van, drive him towards Berlin, and just before they get to West Berlin, they stop. He jumps off and gives himself up and defects. So this story's gone massive story arc, and all of a sudden now Blake has now defected, and basically he lived into his 90s. He only died in 2020. So this story has started in 1939 and has gone right through to 2020. He was living in his dacha just outside Moscow and died an old man, unrepentant, still viewed as a hero.
It's fascinating. You can see how relevant this history is to today, and you can see that it still has an effect on today. Now, there's some interesting things there about Blake and his handing over information. We've already touched on it. and it's that term of tradecraft, which I find absolutely fascinating. I really want to touch on it and talk about, how these spies operated and their tradecraft. So would you mind just unpacking some of that?
Yeah. The tradecraft, as I said, is not a word that was used by the spies themselves until John le Carre wrote about it in his books. So, but anyway, this is the stuff that gets everybody excited because it's the closest we get to James Bond. Your tradecraft involves gizmos and gadgets. It involves ways of communicating. There's something called Moscow rules that you might have heard about. Okay, Moscow rules is another John le Carre word or phrase, but basically describes working to very ultra strict communication protocols. And again, Moscow rules is now accepted within the spy community as meaning something. So again, fiction meets fact. But tradecraft is the way these agents would try and interact with their handlers or couriers. And I think we talked about a few of the bits and bobs as we've gone through. You get sort of quite high-tech communication devices where a message is recorded, a voice message is recorded, and then condensed into a very fast burst transmission. It could be a data transmission as well, sorry, not just voice, but data as well. And you get a burst of just a couple of seconds of transmission. It then gets picked up at the other end and then gets slowed down, and it becomes a readable message. We've talked about the microdots, we've talked about the chalk marks and the drawing pins, but that leads to things like dead drops. So a mark on a certain lamppost at a certain time would tell the handler that the spy has put some information in the dead drop, and the dead drop is a place. It could be a brick in the side of a building that's loose. So the spy would basically go along, he'd stash his photos or his information or whatever inside this hiding place, put the brick back. He'd then go and put this mark on the lamppost. The agent or courier would be looking for this. He'd see the message. He'd go, okay. He'd then go at another time back to this brick wall. He'd remove the brick. He'd take the message out and pass it on to the resident or whatever to pass it on. And that's how they operated. And they went to great lengths to reconnoiter the environment. There's a good story to do with a guy called Penkovsky, who's one of the Western double agents supplying secrets to the West. But the CIA actually they were looking at a radiator in this hallway of a building, and they wanted to get a box that could be stuck behind the radiator. So they got a sample of the paint of the radiator, matched the color back in the US, painted this little box exactly the same color as the radiator. So then the agent could, the handler could plonk this box behind the thing and it wouldn't be seen. So then Penkovsky, as the spy, would go along, surreptitiously remove the box and move on. That sort of interaction, that's what we call tradecraft. And there's a whole load of techniques that can be used to do that. And it's also how they identify themselves. Some of it sounds quite comical. It's you will see this guy come into the pub. He will be wearing this particular outfit. He will be carrying 3 gloves in one hand and a tennis ball. I say it flippantly, but that was the sort of stuff that was done. And you'd use that, what would be bizarre behavior, as a way of identifying who the person was. And that's how it went on for years. And that's tradecraft.
It's an area of the world, like you said, because of these interests with James Bond. It's something that people want to know about, and it is so fascinating hearing about these little secrets and the time and the money that they dedicated towards doing that. Paint matching is not it's not an easy job.
I was surprised at how much prep they put into it. So they'd know exactly how many lampposts there were between A and B. They'd know which lamppost wasn't working. They'd know, which buildings were in shadow at which times of the day, and which pavements were busy or quiet. And I was surprised at how much information was known. I sort of expected to be a bit more casual, but no, they rehearsed absolutely everything.
And it's just really fascinating, that level of detail, isn't it? And I just wanted to, a lot of these figures that we've been talking about have been mainly assisting the Soviets and assisting the communist missions. How many examples, or did they even exist that double? Oh, we've spoken about a couple of them actually. Even Sniper. Did many double agents exist that benefited the West?
The You've got to think about the different environment. I think we were talking about earlier. There's just the completely different existence of living in the West versus living in the East. Yes, you've got competing ideologies. Yes, you've got competing economic systems. But the police state that operated in most of the Warsaw Pact, in most of the Eastern Bloc, was all-consuming. There were spies on every corner. I mean, and when you look at places like East Germany, there literally were spies on almost every corner. The number of people working for the state and passing information on was unbelievable. But working within the Soviet Union, it was a very, very hostile environment to operate. And in the West, obviously, I suppose the West puts freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of thought at the heart of what you call a Western democracy. So therefore, for a Soviet spy to operate in the West, it was a lot easier. He could operate pretty freely. He could, if he wanted to know what was happening with the army, he'd buy a magazine, Stars and Stripes, and it would tell them. He'd just go, he could find all that information free. In the Soviet Union, they were state secrets. So it was a very different place to work. And so operating as a double agent or as a spy placed in the Soviet Union was very, very dangerous. Famous one is Oleg Penkovsky, who was a GRU officer who basically, I think, got a bit fed up with the ideology that was going on in the early 60s. He felt that the Soviet system was wrong, and basically he wanted to do something to support the West. So he offered his services. So a bit like Blake offering his services to the KGB in Korea, Oleg Penkovsky offered his services to the CIA in Moscow. And it took a while for the CIA to actually engage with him. They thought it was provocation to start with, and they in effect ignored it, but he kept going. He kept writing these impassioned letters and managed to get them to the US he intercepted some teachers, some American teachers who were on holiday in Moscow. They were walking across the bridge, sightseeing. He heard they were speaking English. He went up to them, just think of the danger involved in this, and said, "Will you please pass this letter to the CIA?" and then walked off. And then eventually that they took it seriously. They sent a courier, a guy called Greville Wynne. And if you've seen the film, The Courier, with Benedict Cumberbatch and a few others, that's all about Oleg Penkovsky and Greville Wynne. So they sent a courier out to him and they began this dialogue, and he was prolific. He was passing information across on a epic scale. He was unstoppable, and so much so they almost had to tell him to slow down. But he was passionate about trying to defeat communism, so much so that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was able to basically provide Kennedy with information on how these missiles that were based in Cuba worked. So basically that the Americans could understand what sort of timings they were dealing with, how they were loaded, all this sort of stuff. Really important intelligence. So Penkovsky was at the heart of that. And Greville Wynne was his courier, and they went back and forth. And Penkovsky, in his duties as a GRU officer, actually was able to come to Europe and to the UK. And this sort of went on and on and on, up to the day where basically Penkovsky was discovered, and I think he was just over prolific. He put himself out there too much, and was discovered, and went through a show trial and was executed. Simple as that. Greville Wynne was also arrested, and he went through a show trial and was imprisoned, and eventually came back on a spy swap. So, working as a spy in that Soviet bloc was very, very dangerous.
Now, this was a fascinating conversation that I had with Andrew, and it was the first half of the conversation I had with him. If you want to listen to the second part where we talk about context of the period, talking about Germany, the Berlin blockade, and how to find Andrew, where to get his books, and the discount that he has on offer, listen to part 2 with Andrew where we discuss all of these things. But if you don't head to that, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode with Andrew.